Hi, I'm Brandon Neely with the Civil War Institute, and this video will be a little different from our other interpretive videos. First, this video is about economic history, not military history. Second, it's in a different place. I'm not in Gettysburg or another Civil War battlefield. As a matter of fact, I'm not even in the United States. Instead, I'm here in Cairo, the capital of Egypt, and I want to tell you about how the Civil War connects to a country halfway across the world. The connection between Civil War America and Khedivial Egypt is based on one core element: cotton. In the United States, the simple crop formed a cornerstone of the economy. Increased southern production in the early 19th century led to the growth of cotton-related processing businesses in the north, which sped up the process of industrialization nationwide. Cotton was not only utilized domestically, but it also became one of America's primary exports abroad. By the advent of the Civil War, over two-thirds of the world's cotton came from America. As historian Sven Beckert has outlined, 77% of cotton in Britain was American, and in Russia, that number reached as high as 92%. The importance of American cotton to the global economy was no secret. In 1858, South Carolina Senator James Hammond argued that no nation in the world could declare war on America because America would simply stop selling them cotton and their economy would crumble. As he said in the famous speech defending slavery, "No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." But underneath the immense wealth generated from cotton, there was a fundamental problem which would bring Americans to war. The vast majority of the cotton produced in America and shipped to countries like Egypt all over the world was planted, harvested, and processed by enslaved people. By 1850, over 1.8 million enslaved men, women, and children were forced to produce cotton. The relationship was clear. American trade revenue depended on cotton industries, and the cotton industry depended almost entirely on enslaved labor. As the editor of a Baptist missionary newspaper wrote, "The prosperity of the South has been based on the gigantic crime of holding 3 or 4 millions of human beings in a state of slavery." The abolition of slavery would not only upset the racial hierarchies that structured Southern society, but also the economic enterprisers whose labor was justified by those hierarchies. So, rather than give up slavery and the economic prosperity it provided to the slave-owning class, the Southern states seceded from the Union to preserve the institution. In response, President Abraham Lincoln instituted a blockade of Southern ports. This act shut off the Confederacy's ability to export cotton and generate the revenue necessary to fund a long, costly war. The blockade worked extremely well. Southern cotton exports dropped from 3.8 million bales in 1860 to virtually nothing in 1862, according to data compiled by Sven Beckert. Unable to export cotton or import supplies, the blockade prevented the Confederacy from fully developing a wartime economy. Internationally, the sudden and almost total loss of American cotton was quickly felt. This was especially true for England, whose largest industry was cotton-related. According to research from the College of Charleston, 1/6 of the English population was dependent on cotton for their livelihoods. Without continued American imports, the most important sector of the British economy crumbled during the so-called cotton famine. Entire English towns fell into poverty, and bread riots broke out as starving families called for aid. As a result, some British business people supported the Confederacy and called for an end to the Civil War so that cotton exports could resume. Even further, some British businesses sold ships to Confederate operatives for use in the Confederate Navy. In the early stages of the war, British support for the Confederacy was varied and was heavily influenced by one's involvement in the cotton industry. The Confederacy hoped that the need for cotton would bring Britain and other European nations into the war on their side. This would change, however, when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was now unequivocally related to the existence of slavery in the United States. With England having abolished slavery in 1833, the broader public could not support an institution based around the preservation of slavery. With an alliance between England and the Confederacy made impossible, and the war dragging on longer and longer, England had to look elsewhere for its cotton. To satisfy its demand for cotton, England turned here, to Egypt. Throughout history, Egypt has been a great source of agricultural resources. Famously, it was known as the breadbasket of Rome. It also became the major supplier of cotton while America was at war. The discovery of a special type of cotton in 1821 led Muhammad Ali Pasha, the founder of modern Egypt, to invest substantially in the development and export of the now famous Egyptian cotton. The quality of this crop was around the same level as American cotton. Even better, it could be shipped through the Mediterranean Sea rather than all the way around the African continent. As Muhammad Ali Pasha's investments paid off, his successors continued to focus on cotton as a national industry. Under Pasha's Muhammad Said and Ismail, cotton became the primary agricultural export of Egypt. Ismail, in particular, focused on modernizing cotton technology and constructing irrigation projects which are still visible today. Even more, revenue from Egyptian cotton was being used for other developments like the Suez Canal, opera houses, telegram lines, and railroad tracks. By 1864, as the American landscape was being transformed by war, 40% of Lower Egypt's fertile land was being used to make cotton. In the hole that America left, Egypt stepped in. However, just as America's ability to produce cotton and develop wealth was entirely the product of mass enslavement, Egypt's cotton industry also relied on economic exploitation. Egyptian peasant farmers, known as fellahin, were forced to work in the cotton fields. As Mona Abaza writes, it was accomplished by harsh, regimented exploitation of the peasants, so much so that in the collective memory of the village, the days of cotton bear a great affinity with corvée labor and the culture of the kerbaj meaning whip. As these families were forced to abandon their own projects to cultivate cotton, the domestic agricultural industry struggled, driving up the prices of fruits and vegetables, while the fellahin's own economic standing suffered. Thus, Egypt and America are not only linked by cotton, but also by the exploitation and violence associated with its production. Historian Clayton Brown describes it in this way. As the issue of slavery divided the United States, however, cotton became associated with the brutality of forced labor and the suppression of individual liberty. It is tempting to view the economic changes from the antebellum and Civil War period within an American vacuum, but they were deeply connected to economic and political movements across the globe. But the reign of Egyptian cotton would not last. Although production had quintupled during America's absence from global cotton trade, it shrunk after America's return in 1865. Meanwhile, American cotton industry had grown to eclipse its own pre-war levels, regaining its position as the #1 cotton exporter. This return to power was unsurprising. American business people relied on cotton for their wealth, and it was increasingly important as the nation entered a period of social, economic, and literal reconstruction. Systems of sharecropping and tenant farming allowed mass production of cotton to resume, driving global supply up. As the global supply of cotton increased, the price dropped, a dangerous sign for Egypt. The lasting legacy of Egypt's cotton kingdom would not be permanent economic dominance, but instead colonization. Ismail Pasha, who had invested heavily in domestic works using cotton revenue, continued to focus largely on these projects throughout and after the Civil War period. In doing so, he often borrowed from European banks, believing that continued cotton success would help him pay off his debts. However, as cotton prices dropped after 1865 and as his debts continued to grow, it became clear that it would be impossible to break even. Eventually, Egypt declared bankruptcy, and many of the ruling class's investments were sold to Europeans, especially the British. With lots of European investment in Egyptian infrastructure, continued Egyptian debt, and a struggling economy, the British began to take control of Egyptian economic institutions. By World War I, they outright occupied Egypt as a part of the Ottoman Empire. While the slide towards colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries is not just the result of cotton, it remains a significant factor in how Egypt was colonized and when. As Edward Earle writes, one cannot simply study the history of Egypt during the last half of the 19th century without being profoundly impressed by the importance of the American Civil War in the making of modern Egypt, without realizing that the production of Egyptian cotton, stimulated by the blockade of southern ports, contributed materially to the development of important British interests in Egypt, without feeling that the resulting increase in cotton exports from the Nile Valley to Lancashire was a factor in the eventual British occupation of Egypt. The situation which elevated the Egyptian cotton industry to such important heights was a product of the American Civil War. Like I said, this video has been different from our other interpretive projects at the Civil War Institute. I want to thank you for sticking around to the end of this video, and I hope you've learned the following. First, that the American Civil War was an economic conflict, not just a military one. Second, that the American Civil War had global implications and not just national ones. And finally, that ideas of identity, exploitation, economics, and nationhood that define the Civil War era are still being considered and reconsidered today. As America grapples with how to understand its own history and to move forward into the future, so too must Egypt. I'm Brandon Neely with the Civil War Institute, and thank you for watching.